My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 29 years old, and I'll never forget the moment I walked into that courtroom carrying my grandmother's old leather briefcase. My parents rolled their eyes like I was still the family disappointment, the daughter who'd struggled with depression and unemployment for 2 years. They sat there smugly with their expensive lawyer, confident they'd win this $2.3 million inheritance dispute. But when I opened my mouth to speak, Judge Harrison froze completely. Because what I was about to reveal would destroy everything they thought they knew about our family. Before we dive into this story of betrayal and justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're ready for a story that'll show you how family can be your biggest enemy and your greatest teacher, smash that like button and hit subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes to light. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. 6 months before that courtroom showdown, I was sitting in my tiny studio apartment, drowning in bills and self-doubt, when my world completely shattered. I'd been going through my grandmother's old papers, trying to organize her affairs after she passed, when I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. Hidden between yellowed photographs and recipe cards was a bank statement showing a trust fund worth $4.7 million that I'd never heard of before. My hands shook as I read through document after document, realizing that my parents had been systematically stealing my inheritance for years. My mother, Margaret Martinez, was a retired attorney who knew exactly how to manipulate the legal system, and my father, Robert Martinez, was a financial advisor who understood how to hide money trails. Together, they'd created the perfect storm of deception. They'd convinced everyone, including me, that my grandmother had only left behind her small house and a modest savings account worth around $200,000. The house had been sold immediately after her death, and they claimed the money was being managed for the family's benefit. What I discovered was that they'd been transferring funds into my older brother David's name, completely cutting me out of what should have been a split inheritance. The cruelest part was how they justified it. During a family dinner just 3 weeks after my discovery, my mother looked me straight in the eye and declared that I was emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible because of my past struggles with depression and a 2-year period of unemployment. She actually used my mental health against me, claiming that grandmother would never have wanted her money going to someone who couldn't handle life's basic responsibilities. My father nodded along, adding that my drinking problem from 5 years ago proved I wasn't trustworthy with large sums of money. They painted me as the family failure while positioning themselves as the responsible guardians of grandmother's legacy. David, who I'd always looked up to as my protector and closest ally, sat there nodding in agreement. He was 32 years old, successful in his marketing career, and had always seemed to support me through my darkest times.
It all began on a Tuesday
But that
afternoon,
night,
a day
I
that
noticed
seemed
something
ordinary
different in
until
his
the letter
eyes.
arrived.
When I
remember
tried
the
to bring
light
up
was
the
fading,
discrepancies
much
I'd
like it is
found in
now.
grandmother's paperwork, he immediately changed the subject and later pulled me aside to suggest I was seeing things that weren't there due to grief. He offered to help me find a therapist, speaking in that condescending tone that suggested he thought I was having a breakdown. It was the first crack in my trust, though I didn't realize then just how deep his betrayal went. The emotional manipulation was suffocating. Every family gathering became a reminder of my supposed inadequacy. My mother would make subtle comments about my inability to hold down a steady relationship, my father would mention my credit card debt from my unemployment period, and David would offer unsolicited advice about getting my life together. They'd created this narrative where I was the broken family member who needed their guidance and protection, while they were the stable, successful ones who knew what was best for everyone. The gaslighting was so consistent and pervasive that I actually started believing maybe they were right about me. But something deep in my gut told me to keep digging. Maybe it was my grandmother's voice in my head, or maybe it was pure stubborn determination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. My grandmother had always been sharp as a tack right up until her final days, and she'd made several comments about making sure Rebecca was taken care of that didn't align with what my parents were telling me. She'd specifically mentioned wanting me to have her jewelry collection and some special papers that I'd never seen.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that seemed
When I
ordinary
asked my
until the
parents
letter
about these
arrived.
items, they claimed
remember the light
grandmother
was
had been
fading,
confused in
much
her
like it
final
is now.
months and that no such things existed. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to investigate my family's finances, no matter what it cost me emotionally or financially. I knew it would mean going to war with the people who were supposed to love and protect me, but I also knew my grandmother deserved better than having her final wishes trampled by greed and manipulation. I started making copies of every document I could find, taking photos of bank statements, and documenting every conversation where my parents contradicted themselves about the inheritance details. The hardest part was accepting that the family I'd spent 29 years loving and trusting had been lying to me about something so fundamental. These weren't small white lies or minor disagreements about money. This was systematic fraud that had been planned and executed with precision. My own parents had looked me in the eye for months, watching me struggle financially, knowing they had millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to me, and they felt no guilt whatsoever. In fact, they seemed to take pleasure in my struggles, using them as evidence that their theft was justified. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by copied documents and feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life, I made a promise to my grandmother and to myself. I was going to expose the truth, no matter how many people I lost in the process. I was going to fight for what was right, even if it meant destroying the only family I'd ever known.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon,
because
a day
somewhere
that
in
seemed
those
ordinary
papers was the
until the
real
letter
story
arrived.
of my grandmother's love and her
remember the
true
light was
intentions,
fading, much
and I
like it
wasn't
is
going to
now.
let their greed bury that legacy forever. The next morning, I drove to my grandmother's old bank, hoping to get copies of her financial records. I'd assumed it would be a simple process, but when I explained what I needed to the branch manager, his expression shifted uncomfortably. He informed me that Margaret Martinez had been there just 2 weeks prior, presenting legal documentation that gave her power of attorney over all remaining accounts and explicitly restricted access to anyone else, including family members. The manager, who'd known my grandmother for 15 years, seemed genuinely confused by the situation but explained his hands were tied legally. Walking out of that bank, I felt the full weight of my mother's manipulation hit me. She'd used her legal expertise to systematically block every avenue I might take to uncover the truth. This wasn't just theft, it was a carefully orchestrated plan to ensure I could never fight back. Margaret had anticipated that I might eventually start asking questions, and she'd preemptively cut off my access to information. The level of premeditation was breathtaking and terrifying. That afternoon, desperation drove me to call my college roommate Sarah Chin, who'd become a forensic accountant specializing in financial fraud cases. We'd lost touch over the years, but I remembered her sharp mind and relentless attention to detail. When I explained my situation, Sarah's professional interest was immediately piqued.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon, a day
She
that seemed
agreed to meet
ordinary
me for
until the
coffee,
letter arrived.
and within an hour of reviewing the
the light was
documents I'd
fading,
managed to
much
gather,
like it is now.
she confirmed my worst fears. The financial patterns she identified suggested sophisticated money laundering techniques that would require both legal and financial expertise to execute properly. Sarah's analysis revealed something even more shocking than I'd imagined. Based on the transaction patterns and account structures she could piece together from my limited documents, she estimated that my grandmother's true estate was worth closer to $7 million, not the 4.7 I'd initially discovered. The complexity of the shell companies and trust structures indicated this theft had been planned for years, possibly even while my grandmother was still alive and trusting her daughter to handle her financial affairs. But Margaret wasn't finished with her attacks. 3 days after my bank visit, I received a certified letter from a psychiatrist I'd never met, claiming I'd missed multiple appointments for court-ordered mental health evaluations. The letter referenced a psychological assessment from my depression treatment 5 years earlier, but it had been deliberately altered to suggest I was currently experiencing severe mental health episodes that impaired my judgment. Margaret had somehow obtained my private medical records and was using them to build a case that I was mentally incompetent to handle financial decisions. The violation felt like being stripped naked in public. My lowest moments, my most vulnerable struggles with mental health, were being weaponized against me by my own mother.
Until the letter arrived.
The same woman who'd held me while I cried during my darkest depression was now using that intimacy to destroy my credibility. She knew exactly which psychological buttons to push because she'd been there during my healing process. It was betrayal on the most personal level imaginable. When I called Sarah in tears about the psychological warfare, she connected me with someone who would become my lifeline. Jake Morrison was a former FBI agent turned private investigator who specialized in family financial crimes. Sarah had worked with him on several cases where family members had defrauded elderly relatives, and she trusted his discretion and expertise. Jake agreed to meet with us, and his calm, methodical approach immediately gave me hope that maybe I wasn't completely powerless against my family's legal and financial resources. During our first meeting, Jake explained that family financial abuse was far more common than people realized, and that perpetrators often used the same psychological manipulation tactics I was experiencing. He'd seen cases where children systematically drained their parents' accounts, where siblings fought over inheritances worth millions, and where elderly people were manipulated into changing their wills under pressure. My situation wasn't unique, but that didn't make it any less devastating. Jake's investigation strategy was comprehensive and patient. He explained that rushing into legal action without solid evidence would only give my parents more opportunities to cover their tracks. Instead, we needed to methodically build an evidence case that could withstand aggressive legal challenges.
I remember the light was fading,
He warned me that
much
this
like it is
process
now.
could take months and would require me to endure continued psychological attacks while we gathered proof. The hardest part would be pretending I didn't know what they were doing while they continued their manipulation campaign. As we left that meeting, I felt simultaneously hopeful and terrified. For the first time since discovering the theft, I had allies who believed me and had the expertise to help me fight back. But I also understood that I was declaring war on my family, and there would be no going back once we started this investigation. My parents had already shown they were willing to use my mental health, my financial struggles, and my past mistakes against me. If they discovered I was building a case against them, there was no telling how far they'd go to discredit and destroy me. That night, I sat in my apartment looking through old photo albums, trying to reconcile the smiling faces in those pictures with the calculated criminals I was now fighting. These were people who'd celebrated my birthday, attended my graduations, and comforted me through heartbreak. How had love twisted into such methodical cruelty? How had the family that was supposed to protect me become the greatest threat to my future and well-being? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but I knew I had to push through it if I wanted any chance of justice for my grandmother and myself. Jake's investigation began with what seemed like routine background checks, but within 2 weeks, he'd uncovered a pattern of financial manipulation that stretched back over a decade.
A day that seemed ordinary until
My
the letter
parents
arrived.
hadn't just stolen from my
I remember
grandmother,
the light was
they'd been
fading,
systematically
much like it is
draining
now.
her accounts for years while she was still alive. Bank records showed regular transfers of $20,000 to $30,000 moving from her accounts into various business entities controlled by Robert. The transfers were often disguised as consulting fees or investment management services, but the timing coincided perfectly with my grandmother's increasing confusion about her finances in her final years. The most chilling discovery came when Jake traced the business entities receiving those transfers. Robert had created shell companies with names like Martinez Family Trust Services and Heritage Wealth Management that existed solely to launder money from my grandmother's accounts. These weren't legitimate businesses, they were sophisticated theft mechanisms designed to make the money transfers look legal if anyone ever questioned them. The level of premeditation and planning required to set up these structures meant my parents had been planning this theft for years, possibly from the moment my grandmother started showing signs of aging. But the true bombshell came when Jake discovered that my grandmother had been aware of at least some of the theft. Hidden in a safety deposit box under her maiden name, which Jake tracked down through property records, were audio recordings she'd made during the last 6 months of her life. In these recordings, her voice was clear and determined as she documented her growing suspicion that Margaret was stealing from her. She'd actually confronted my mother about discrepancies in her account statements, and Margaret had convinced her that she was becoming confused due to her age and medication.
I remember the light
Listening
was fading,
to those
much like
recordings
it
was
is now.
devastating. My grandmother's voice, which I'd always associated with warmth and comfort, was filled with confusion and betrayal as she tried to understand why her own daughter would lie to her about money. In one particularly heartbreaking recording, she talked about wanting to make sure I was properly provided for, because she knew I'd struggled more than David and needed the financial security. She specifically mentioned wanting to leave me the majority of her estate because she believed I had the biggest heart and the hardest path ahead. But Robert escalated his attacks just as we were making these discoveries. Using his connections in the banking industry, he managed to get my personal checking account frozen under suspicious activity reports. Suddenly, I couldn't access my own money to pay rent or buy groceries, let alone fund the investigation that was uncovering his crimes. The freeze was positioned as a routine fraud protection measure, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Robert was sending a clear message that he could destroy my financial life whenever he chose. The psychological warfare intensified when my Uncle Thomas, Robert's younger brother, showed up at my apartment unannounced. Thomas had always been the family member I felt closest to outside of my grandmother. He'd been like a second father to me, taking me to baseball games and helping me with homework when my parents were too busy. His presence in my doorway felt like salvation until he started talking.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon,
Thomas had come to offer me $50,000 in cash if I would stop this destructive investigation and let the family heal. The betrayal hit like a physical blow when I realized that even Thomas, who I'd trusted completely, had known about the theft and been part of covering it up. Thomas's visit revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against me. He admitted that the family had been discussing my financial desperation and emotional instability for months, painting me as someone who was trying to create problems because I needed money. He claimed they were all concerned about my mental health and thought that pursuing this inheritance dispute would only make my psychological problems worse. The gaslighting was so thorough and coordinated that for a moment, I actually questioned whether I was seeing conspiracies where none existed. The manipulation reached a terrifying new level when Margaret hired a private investigator to follow me. I first noticed the same car appearing in my rearview mirror multiple times, then realized my phone conversations were being referenced in family discussions I hadn't shared with anyone. Jake confirmed my suspicions when his counter surveillance detected listening devices in my apartment and tracking equipment on my car. My own mother was treating me like a criminal while she was the one committing crimes. The violation of privacy felt almost worse than the financial theft because it meant nowhere was safe from their reach. The lowest point came when I was driving home from meeting with Jake one evening. A pickup truck ran a red light and nearly collided with my car, missing me by inches.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon, a
the
day
driver
that seemed
didn't
ordinary
stop,
until
and
the
I only
letter
got
arrived.
a partial license plate,
I remember
but
the
the
light
timing
was
felt
fading,
too
much like it
coincidental
is
after
now.
all the other escalating attacks. Jake took the incident seriously enough to recommend I vary my routes and be extra cautious, which meant acknowledging that my family might actually pose a physical threat to my safety. The people who were supposed to protect me were potentially willing to hurt me to protect their theft. That night, sitting in my apartment with new locks installed and blinds drawn, I seriously considered giving up. The emotional, financial, and now potentially physical attacks were wearing me down to nothing. I was isolated from my family, struggling to pay basic bills, and living in fear of what they might do next. The $50,000 Thomas had offered would solve my immediate problems and let me walk away from this nightmare. Maybe they were right, maybe I was just the unstable family member who was imagining things and causing problems for everyone else. But then I remembered my grandmother's voice on those recordings, confused and hurt as she tried to understand why her daughter was lying to her about money. I thought about all the other elderly people who might be experiencing similar betrayal from their own children. I realized that walking away wouldn't just mean accepting my own victimization, it would mean letting my parents continue their pattern of manipulation and theft with no consequences. My grandmother deserved better, and maybe by fighting for her, I could find the strength and purpose I'd been missing in my own life. Jake found the hidden safety deposit box on a Thursday afternoon in February,
a day that seemed
and everything
ordinary
changed.
until the letter arrived.
Inside,
I remember the
along
light
with
was
my
fading,
grandmother's
much
audio
like it is
recordings,
now.
were copies of her real financial statements, photos of documents she'd hidden from Margaret, and most importantly, a handwritten will that was completely different from the one my parents had submitted to probate court. In this real will, my grandmother had left 70% of her estate to me, 20% to David, and only 10% to my parents. She'd also included a detailed letter explaining her reasoning, stating that she wanted to ensure my financial security because she knew I'd face more challenges in life than the rest of the family. The safety deposit box was like opening a time capsule of my grandmother's love and her growing awareness of the betrayal surrounding her. Beyond the will and audio recordings, she'd meticulously documented every suspicious transaction, every time Margaret had pressured her to sign papers she didn't understand, and every instance where her questions about money were dismissed or redirected. My grandmother had been conducting her own investigation in her final months, gathering evidence that would eventually expose the full scope of my parents' deception. Her handwritten notes revealed a brilliant mind that had been far sharper than anyone realized. She'd noticed that Margaret always brought papers for her to sign during times when she was tired or medicated, and she'd started secretly photographing documents before signing them. She'd also been recording phone conversations with Margaret about financial matters, using an old tape recorder hidden in her bedroom. The evidence showed that Margaret had been lying to her mother for years about investment performance,
a day that seemed
account
ordinary
balances,
until the letter
and fee
arrived.
structures while
I remember
systematically
the light
moving
was
money
fading,
into accounts
much
my
like it is
grandmother
now.
couldn't access. The most damning piece of evidence was a video recording my grandmother had made just 6 weeks before her death. In this recording, she was sitting in her favorite chair, speaking directly to the camera with complete mental clarity. She stated her full name, the date, and her explicit intention to leave the majority of her estate to me because she knew I would use the money responsibly and help others who were struggling. She specifically mentioned her concern that Margaret and Robert were more interested in money than people, and that she wanted her wealth to go to someone who would honor her values of kindness and generosity. But Margaret was far from finished with her attacks. The day after Jake made the safety deposit box discovery, I received a call from the police station asking me to come in for questioning about alleged theft of family documents. Margaret had filed a report claiming I'd broken into her home and stolen financial papers, presenting a carefully crafted story about how my mental health crisis had driven me to commit crimes against my family. She'd even provided photos of her home office with papers scattered around to suggest a break-in, though Jake's investigation would later prove the photos had been staged. The police interview was a nightmare of psychological manipulation where Margaret's version of events made me sound like a delusional criminal. She provided them with copies of my old therapy records, documentation of my previous financial struggles, and statements from family members describing my increasingly erratic behavior over recent months. The detective asking questions clearly believed I was a disturbed young woman who was harassing her family over imaginary inheritance issues.
I remember the light was fading, much like it is now.
I left that interview feeling like my credibility was completely destroyed and wondering if anyone would ever believe my side of the story. My financial situation reached a crisis point when I lost my newly started job as a marketing assistant. My boss explained that they'd received concerning information about my involvement in legal proceedings and potential mental health issues that made me unsuitable for a position requiring financial responsibility. I knew immediately that Margaret had used her legal connections to sabotage my employment, but I had no way to prove it. Suddenly, I was unemployed again, facing eviction, and burning through my savings to pay Jake and the legal team we'd assembled. But losing that job actually freed me to focus entirely on building the case against my family. Sarah had been working evenings and weekends to analyze the financial evidence, and her discoveries were staggering. She'd found evidence of tax evasion, wire fraud, elder abuse, and multiple violations of fiduciary duty. The theft was even larger than we'd initially estimated, with total missing funds approaching $8 million when investment returns were properly calculated. My parents hadn't just stolen from my grandmother, they'd stolen my entire future financial security. The turning point came when I decided to stop being a passive victim and start fighting back with their own tactics. Sarah helped me understand exactly which financial laws my parents had broken, and I began documenting their current activities with the same meticulous attention to detail my grandmother had shown.
I remember the light was fading, much
when
like it is now.
David called to offer me $100,000 to end this family conflict, I secretly recorded the conversation, capturing his admission that they'd been moving money specifically to keep it away from me. Jake's network of contacts proved invaluable when we discovered that my parents weren't the only criminals in their social circle. 3 other families in their wealthy neighborhood had experienced similar inheritance thefts, with Margaret actually providing legal consultation on how to minimize estate taxes through family trust structures. These other cases were still unresolved, meaning there were other victims who could provide testimony about Margaret's pattern of elder financial abuse. We weren't just fighting for my grandmother's money anymore, we were potentially exposing a whole network of family financial crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that my family would never admit their guilt or negotiate a fair settlement. Margaret's ego and legal training meant she would fight until the bitter end, probably believing she could outmaneuver me in court through superior resources and connections. Robert's financial expertise meant he would continue trying to hide assets and complicate the legal proceedings for as long as possible. They were going to force this to trial, which meant exposing everything publicly and destroying our family relationships permanently. As we prepared for legal proceedings, I had to confront the reality that I was about to lose my entire family in pursuit of justice.
A day that seemed ordinary until the letter
David
arrived.
might be following our parents'
I remember
lead,
the light
but
was
he was
fading,
still my brother,
much like it is
and there
now.
might have been a chance to salvage our relationship if I'd accepted their offers and walked away. Thomas and other extended family members would never forgive me for exposing family secrets in court proceedings. I would win or lose this case completely alone, with no family support system regardless of the outcome. But I also realized that the family I was fighting to preserve hadn't actually existed for years. The love and loyalty I remembered from my childhood had been conditional on my compliance and silence about their wrongdoing. They'd been willing to let me struggle financially while they hoarded stolen money, willing to use my mental health against me, and willing to sabotage my career to protect their theft. The family I was grieving had been an illusion, and fighting for the truth was the only way to honor my grandmother's memory and create the possibility of a more authentic future for myself. The final piece of preparation was emotional rather than legal. I had to accept that this battle would change me fundamentally, transforming me from someone who avoided conflict to someone willing to fight for justice regardless of the personal cost. I had to become harder, more strategic, and more willing to inflict pain on people I'd once loved. It wasn't who I'd wanted to become, but it was who I needed to be to survive their attacks and protect other potential victims of their schemes. With the evidence secured and Jake's investigation complete, I faced the daunting task of finding an attorney willing to take on a family with Margaret's legal connections and resources.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that seemed
3
ordinary
law
until the
firms
letter
declined
arrived.
to represent me after learning my mother was involved,
fading, much
citing
like it is
potential
now.
conflicts of interest or scheduling issues that seemed suspiciously convenient. Margaret's reputation in the legal community was working in her favor, creating barriers that made it clear she'd anticipated this possibility and built professional relationships specifically to limit my options. The breakthrough came through Sarah's professional network when she connected me with Elena Rodriguez, a fierce litigator specializing in elder financial abuse cases. Elena had built her career taking on wealthy families who preyed on elderly relatives, and she wasn't intimidated by Margaret's connections or Robert's financial resources. During our first meeting, Elena reviewed our evidence with the enthusiasm of a prosecutor who'd just been handed a slam-dunk case. She explained that elder financial abuse was becoming increasingly common as families struggled with healthcare costs and inheritance planning, making my case part of a larger societal issue that deserved attention. Elena's strategy was comprehensive and aggressive. Rather than simply pursuing civil recovery of the stolen funds, she wanted to refer the case for criminal prosecution while simultaneously filing a civil lawsuit for damages including emotional distress and punitive measures. She believed the evidence was strong enough to result in criminal charges against both my parents, which would add pressure for them to negotiate rather than face potential imprisonment. The criminal case would also generate media attention that could expose similar crimes in other families and potentially help additional victims come forward.
A day that seemed
But
ordinary
Margaret
until
wasn't
the letter
waiting passively
arrived.
for us to
I
file our
remember the
lawsuit.
light was fading, much like it is now.
She launched a preemptive strike by petitioning the court to have me declared mentally incompetent to handle my own affairs, using the psychological evaluation records she'd obtained illegally. Her petition claimed I was experiencing a prolonged mental health crisis that made me unable to distinguish reality from delusion, and she requested appointment as my financial guardian to protect me from making decisions that could harm my future. The audacity was breathtaking. She was trying to use the legal system to complete her theft by having me declared incompetent to challenge it. Elena immediately filed counter motions challenging Margaret's petition and demanding sanctions for her illegal access to sealed medical records. We also filed a motion for emergency protective orders to prevent further disposal of assets, knowing that Robert was likely moving money offshore or into accounts we couldn't trace. The legal maneuvering became a chess match where every move had to anticipate multiple counter moves, and the stakes were my entire future financial security and legal autonomy. The psychological pressure intensified when David showed up at my apartment again, this time offering me $500,000 to settle the dispute privately and avoid court proceedings. He explained that the family was willing to acknowledge that mistakes had been made in handling grandmother's estate, and they wanted to make things right, without the expense and embarrassment of public litigation. His offer was carefully scripted to avoid admitting any wrongdoing while appearing generous enough to seem like a reasonable compromise.
A day that seemed ordinary until
But
the
I'd
letter
learned to
arrived.
recognize manipulation
I remember
tactics,
the light was fading,
and I secretly
much like it is
recorded
now.
David's visit using equipment Jake had provided. During our conversation, David inadvertently admitted that they'd been protecting assets from me because they believed I wasn't ready to handle large sums of money responsibly. He also revealed that they'd been consulting with financial advisors about moving money into international accounts, which confirmed Elena's suspicions about asset hiding. His visit provided additional evidence for our case while demonstrating that they still viewed me as someone who could be bought off or manipulated. The family's desperation became obvious when Thomas contacted my former employer and several potential employers, spreading stories about my legal troubles and family conflicts that made me unemployable in my field. The campaign was sophisticated enough to seem like legitimate reference checking, but the timing and coordination made it clear this was retaliation for refusing their settlement offers. They were systematically destroying my ability to support myself financially while the legal case progressed, hoping to force me into accepting their terms through economic pressure. Elena uncovered evidence that Margaret had been consulting with other attorneys about strategies for discrediting adult children who challenge estate planning decisions. She'd actually attended seminars on protecting family assets from unstable beneficiaries, and had researched materials about using mental health histories to challenge inheritance claims. This wasn't just my family's crime. Margaret was developing expertise that she could apply to other families facing similar conflicts.
Until the letter arrived.
The scope of her planning and preparation was both impressive and terrifying. Jake's investigation revealed that my parents had been living far beyond their apparent income for years, funding their lifestyle through systematic theft from my grandmother's accounts. Their expensive cars, luxury vacations, and home renovations had all been paid for with money that should have been mine and David's inheritance. The lifestyle inflation wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate strategy to spend the stolen money in ways that would be difficult to recover, creating additional urgency around filing our lawsuit before more assets disappeared. The most shocking discovery was that my grandmother had actually tried to change her will in the final month of her life, specifically to increase my inheritance and add additional protections against family manipulation. She'd contacted an attorney independently and begun the process of updating her estate planning, but Margaret had intervened by convincing the attorney that my grandmother was experiencing dementia and couldn't make legal decisions. The attorney's notes showed he'd been uncomfortable with Margaret's involvement but had deferred to her medical claims and professional credentials. As the court filing deadline approached, I had to confront the reality that this legal battle would consume years of my life and potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Even if we won completely, the emotional and financial cost would be enormous. I would be fighting my family in public, exposing intimate details about our relationships and their criminal behavior, while they continued their campaign to discredit and destroy me.
A day that seemed ordinary until the letter
The
arrived.
victory might be Pyrrhic, leaving me financially secure but completely isolated from everyone I'd once considered family. But Elena reminded me that backing down would set a dangerous precedent for other families facing similar situations. Elder financial abuse was often successful because victims' families were too embarrassed or intimidated to pursue justice publicly. By fighting this case aggressively and publicly, we could potentially prevent other families from suffering similar betrayals. My grandmother's case could become a landmark that changed how courts handle family financial abuse cases and what protections exist for elderly people and their intended beneficiaries. The night before we filed our lawsuit, I sat in my apartment surrounded by boxes of evidence, looking through old family photos and trying to remember when everything had started going wrong. Had my parents always been capable of this level of deception and cruelty, or had greed gradually corrupted their capacity for love and honesty? Was David truly complicit, or was he just following their lead because it was easier than confronting the truth about our family? The questions would probably never have satisfactory answers, but I knew I had to stop looking backward and focus on the fight ahead. The 24 hours before our court filing deadline marked the most intense psychological warfare I'd ever experienced. Margaret unleashed every weapon in her arsenal, starting with a coordinated media campaign designed to discredit me before our case could gain public attention.
Ordinary until the letter arrived.
She'd somehow leaked carefully edited information about my mental health history to a local newspaper reporter, resulting in an article about inheritance disputes arising from family mental health crises that portrayed me as a disturbed individual harassing my grieving family over imaginary financial issues. The newspaper article was devastating because it contained just enough factual information to seem credible while completely distorting the context and timeline of events. Margaret had provided documentation of my previous depression treatment, my employment struggles, and my financial difficulties, but presented these facts as evidence of current mental instability rather than past challenges I'd overcome. The article never mentioned the audio recordings, the falsified documents, or the evidence of systematic theft, instead focusing on my allegations and claims that couldn't be independently verified. Robert escalated his financial attacks by somehow triggering additional fraud alerts on my credit reports, making it impossible for me to open new bank accounts or access credit when my existing account remained frozen. The timing wasn't coincidental. He was ensuring I'd be financially desperate and unable to continue funding legal proceedings just as we approached the critical filing deadline. The economic pressure was designed to force me into accepting their settlement offer at the last possible moment, when I'd be most vulnerable and least able to continue fighting. But the most devastating attack came through David, who showed up at my apartment at midnight with what he claimed was a final opportunity to save our family.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that seemed ordinary until the letter arrived.
He brought photocopies of family pictures spanning decades,
I remember
spreading
the light
them
was
across
fading,
my coffee
much like it
table
is
as he
now.
begged me to remember the love we'd shared and the relationships that would be destroyed by public litigation. His emotional manipulation was sophisticated, focusing on my guilt about hurting our parents and my fear of being completely alone if I continued pursuing the case. David's midnight visit included a confession that left me reeling. He admitted that he'd known about some financial irregularities in grandmother's accounts but had chosen to trust our parents' explanations rather than investigate further. He claimed he'd been gradually discovering the extent of the problems over recent months and was horrified by what they'd done, but he still begged me to handle the situation privately to avoid destroying everyone's lives. His admission of willful ignorance felt almost worse than outright betrayal, because it meant he'd chosen convenience over protecting our grandmother and me. The emotional manipulation reached its peak when David started crying, something I'd rarely seen in our adult lives. He talked about his own guilt and shame over what our parents had done, his fear that public revelation would destroy his career and marriage, and his desperate hope that we could find a way to make things right without court proceedings. He offered to personally guarantee that I'd receive a fair settlement, promising to monitor our parents' compliance and serve as an intermediary to ensure they honored any agreement we reached. For a moment, sitting there surrounded by family photos and watching my brother's genuine distress, I almost wavered in my determination to pursue justice through the courts.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon,
the part of me that still loved my family
until the
desperately
letter
wanted to
arrived.
believe that private reconciliation was possible,
much
that
like
we
it
could
is
find
now.
a way to address the theft while preserving some version of our relationships. David seemed sincere in his remorse and his commitment to ensuring I was treated fairly, and the prospect of avoiding a public battle was incredibly appealing. But Elena had prepared me for exactly this kind of last-minute pressure, and I remembered her warnings about how family financial abusers often used emotional manipulation to avoid consequences when their crimes were discovered. David's tears and promises couldn't change the fundamental fact that my parents had committed serious crimes over many years, and private settlements would allow them to escape accountability while potentially enabling them to repeat their behavior with other elderly relatives or clients. Justice required public accountability, not private deals that protected their reputations and freedom. I also realized that David's proposed solution still positioned me as someone who needed family permission and oversight to manage my own inheritance. His offer to monitor our parents' compliance implied that I couldn't be trusted to handle the situation independently, perpetuating the same condescending dynamic that had enabled their theft in the first place. Even his apparent remorse contained subtle implications that I was being unreasonable or vindictive by insisting on legal accountability for their crimes. The next morning, just hours before our filing deadline, Margaret made her final desperate play. She contacted Elena directly, claiming she wanted to discuss settlement terms that could avoid court proceedings.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that
During
seemed
their phone
ordinary until the
conversation,
letter arrived.
Margaret offered full restitution
the
of the
light was
stolen
fading,
funds plus
much
an
like it is
additional $1
now.
million in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements that would prevent me from discussing the case publicly or referring it for criminal prosecution. She positioned this as a generous offer that would give me more money than I could possibly win in court while protecting family privacy. Elena immediately recognized this offer as an admission of guilt and potential obstruction of justice, since Margaret was essentially trying to buy my silence about crimes that warranted criminal investigation. We recorded the conversation with Margaret's knowledge, capturing her implicit acknowledgement that serious wrongdoing had occurred and her willingness to pay substantial sums to avoid accountability. The recording would become crucial evidence of consciousness of guilt if our case proceeded to trial. But Margaret's offer revealed just how much money was actually involved in this theft. Her willingness to pay millions beyond full restitution suggested that the real value of stolen assets was far higher than even Sarah's sophisticated analysis had uncovered. They weren't just trying to avoid embarrassment or legal fees, they were trying to avoid returning the full scope of what they'd taken from my grandmother over the years. The desperation behind the offer confirmed that we were on the right track and that proceeding with litigation was the only way to uncover the complete truth. As I prepared for the courthouse that morning, I took extra care with my appearance, choosing my grandmother's favorite dress and carrying the leather briefcase that had belonged to her father. I wanted to honor their memory while presenting myself as a credible, stable individual worthy of respect and justice.
I remember the light
I
was
knew
fading,
my parents would
much
try
like
to
it is
use
now.
my appearance, demeanor, and responses against me, so I prepared mentally to remain calm and dignified regardless of their provocations or attempts to trigger emotional reactions. The morning routine felt surreal as I got ready to potentially destroy my relationship with my family forever while fighting for justice my grandmother had deserved. I thought about all the family holidays, birthday celebrations, and milestone moments we'd shared over the years, knowing that today might be the last time I'd see my parents as anything other than adversaries in a legal battle. The sadness was overwhelming, but it was overshadowed by determination to honor my grandmother's memory and ensure that her final wishes were finally respected. Walking into that courthouse, I carried not just evidence and legal documents, but the weight of representing every elderly person who'd been betrayed by their own family, every adult child who'd been gaslighted and manipulated when they tried to expose family crimes, and every person who'd been told they were too unstable or unworthy to fight for their rights. This case was bigger than my inheritance. It was about whether families could commit crimes against their most vulnerable members with impunity, and whether love could be used as a weapon to silence victims of financial abuse. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the faces of everyone present. My parents sat at the defendant's table with their expensive attorney, Margaret wearing her most conservative suit and Robert looking appropriately somber and concerned.
A day that seemed ordinary
They
until the
positioned
letter
themselves
arrived.
as loving parents
I remember
forced to
the light
deal
was
with a
fading,
mentally
much
unstable
like it is
daughter's
now.
delusions, and their body language conveyed patient suffering rather than guilt or anxiety. David sat in the gallery behind them, avoiding eye contact with me but clearly there to show family solidarity against my false accusations. Judge William Harrison had a reputation for fairness and intolerance for financial elder abuse, which Elena had researched thoroughly before we filed in his jurisdiction. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing as he reviewed the preliminary motions and evidence summaries we'd submitted. His previous rulings in similar cases suggested he wouldn't be intimidated by Margaret's legal credentials or swayed by emotional appeals about family loyalty over legal accountability. Margaret's opening statement was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as legal argument. She painted me as a troubled young woman who'd never recovered from childhood mental health issues, someone who'd become increasingly desperate and delusional as my financial situation worsened. She presented my investigation into family finances as evidence of paranoid thinking, my recording of family conversations as proof of declining judgment, and my allegations against my parents as the tragic result of untreated psychological problems combined with financial desperation. Her strategy was brilliant because it used my own mental health advocacy against me. She acknowledged that depression and anxiety were serious medical conditions that deserved compassion,
It all began on a Tuesday
but argued that my
afternoon,
current
a day that
episode
seemed
was so
ordinary
severe that I
until the
couldn't
letter
distinguish
arrived.
reality from
I
delusion.
remember the light was fading,
She
much
presented
like it is
medical
now.
records showing my previous treatment, financial records documenting my employment struggles, and character witnesses who would testify about my increasingly erratic behavior over recent months. The picture she painted was of a family trying to help someone who was too sick to accept assistance. But Margaret made a critical error when she started discussing my grandmother's final months. In her eagerness to establish that my grandmother had been confused and easily manipulated, she provided detailed testimony about their conversations regarding financial matters, estate planning, and my grandmother's concerns about her memory and judgment. She was establishing a foundation that would actually support our evidence about my grandmother's awareness of the theft and her attempts to document what was happening to her money. Robert's testimony was equally damaging to their case, though he didn't seem to realize it. He described his professional management of my grandmother's investments with the precision of someone who'd been keeping meticulous records of his activities. He explained complex financial instruments, trust structures, and investment strategies that he claimed had been designed to protect my grandmother's assets from taxes and market volatility. But his detailed knowledge contradicted Margaret's claims that my grandmother had been too confused to understand her financial affairs. The family's coordinated testimony began falling apart when David took the stand as a character witness for our parents. Under Elena's cross-examination, he admitted that he'd been receiving regular financial transfers from accounts he knew belonged to my grandmother, but claimed he believed these were gifts rather than inheritance advances. When Elena pressed him about the timing and amounts of these transfers, he became confused and contradicted his earlier testimony about when he'd first learned about potential problems with the estate handling. But the real turning point came when Elena called Jake Morrison as our first witness. Jake's FBI background and forensic accounting expertise immediately established credibility that countered Margaret's attempts to dismiss our evidence as amateur speculation. He methodically walked the court through his investigation timeline, explaining how he traced money movements, identified shell companies, and discovered the hidden safety deposit box. His testimony was calm, factual, and devastating to my parents' credibility. Jake's presentation of the audio recordings was the moment everything changed in that courtroom. My grandmother's voice filled the space, clear and determined as she documented her growing awareness that Margaret was stealing from her accounts. The recordings captured her confusion and pain as she tried to understand why her daughter would lie to her about money, and her determination to ensure that her real wishes would eventually be discovered and honored. Judge Harrison's expression shifted noticeably as he listened to an elderly woman describing her daughter's betrayal in her own words. But the most powerful moment came when Elena played my grandmother's video testament, the recording she'd made just weeks before her death specifically to document her true intentions for her estate. Judge Harrison leaned forward as my grandmother looked directly into the camera and stated clearly that she was leaving the majority of her wealth to me because she knew I would use it responsibly and help others.
I remember the light was
fading.
She
specifically mentioned her concerns about Margaret and Robert's priorities, and her hope that I would honor her values of generosity and service to others. When I finally took the stand to present my testimony, the courtroom atmosphere had completely shifted. Judge Harrison was no longer looking at me as a potentially unstable young woman making wild accusations, but as a victim whose grandmother had predicted exactly what would happen and tried to leave evidence to protect me. My parents' expressions had changed from confident superiority to barely concealed panic as they realized their carefully constructed narrative was collapsing under the weight of actual evidence. My testimony was straightforward and factual, focusing on the timeline of my discoveries and my attempts to address the situation through family discussions before pursuing legal remedies. I didn't need to be emotional or dramatic, the evidence spoke for itself, and my calm presentation contrasted sharply with Margaret's increasingly frantic objections and attempts to discredit each piece of documentation we presented. Elena had prepared me to remain composed regardless of provocation, and that preparation proved invaluable as Margaret tried desperately to rattle me during cross-examination. The moment that made Judge Harrison freeze came when I began explaining my grandmother's prediction about this exact courtroom scenario. I described finding her letter specifically addressed to me, warning that if I was ever fighting for my inheritance in court, it would mean that Margaret had succeeded in her theft and I should trust the evidence rather than family pressure to abandon my case.
It all began on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that seemed ordinary
my grandmother
until the letter
had literally
arrived.
written instructions for this
remember the
moment,
light was fading,
understanding
much
that
like it
emotional
is now.
manipulation would be used to try to silence me even after her death. As I finished my testimony and returned to my seat, the silence in the courtroom was profound. Judge Harrison was staring at the evidence table, processing the scope of betrayal we documented, while my parents sat frozen in apparent shock that their victim had turned out to be far more prepared and supported than they'd anticipated. Margaret's confident legal strategy had been built on assumptions about my isolation and vulnerability that were proving catastrophically wrong. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like justice might actually be possible. Judge Harrison called for a 30-minute recess after my testimony, and I watched my parents huddled in desperate conversation with their attorney while David sat alone in the gallery looking like he might be sick. Margaret's confident demeanor had evaporated completely, replaced by the frantic energy of someone whose carefully constructed lies were unraveling in public. Robert kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between hatred and what might have been grudging respect for how thoroughly I'd prepared for this battle. When court resumed, Elena methodically presented the financial evidence that Sarah had analyzed, walking Judge Harrison through years of fraudulent transactions, hidden accounts, and deliberate theft disguised as estate management. The numbers were staggering. Over $7.8 million had been systematically moved out of my grandmother's legitimate accounts into shell companies and family accounts controlled by my parents.
Much like it is now.
Sarah's forensic analysis showed that if my grandmother's investments had been managed honestly, her estate would have been worth over $10 million by the time of her death. But the most damning evidence was the proof that my parents had continued stealing even after my grandmother died, using forged signatures and fraudulent documents to access accounts and liquidate assets that should have been frozen pending probate proceedings. Elena presented bank security footage showing Robert using a forged power of attorney to withdraw funds just days after my grandmother's funeral, when he knew I would be too grief-stricken to monitor the accounts closely. The premeditation and heartlessness were breathtaking. Margaret's defense strategy completely collapsed when Elena presented evidence of the other families who'd been victimized by similar schemes. Margaret hadn't just stolen from her own mother, she'd been providing legal consultation to other wealthy families on how to structure inheritances to minimize children's access to family wealth. Her law practice had essentially been a criminal enterprise specializing in elder financial abuse, with my grandmother's case being just one example of a systematic pattern of exploitation. The courtroom atmosphere became electric when Elena called Margaret to the stand for cross-examination. Margaret's legal training made her a formidable witness, but Elena's preparation was flawless. Under aggressive questioning, Margaret was forced to admit that she'd accessed my sealed medical records without authorization, that she'd used her legal connections to interfere with my employment opportunities, and that she'd created false documents to support her claims about my mental competency. Each admission destroyed another piece of her credibility while building our case for punitive damages. Robert's testimony was even more damaging because he lacked Margaret's courtroom experience and legal sophistication. Elena systematically walked him through each fraudulent transaction, forcing him to acknowledge that he'd known the money belonged to my grandmother while he was moving it into accounts she couldn't access. His attempts to justify the theft as protecting family assets only highlighted the calculated nature of their crimes and their complete disregard for my grandmother's autonomy and wishes. The most shocking revelation came when Elena presented evidence that my parents had been planning this theft for over a decade. They'd gradually gained control of my grandmother's financial accounts through legitimate power of attorney arrangements, then systematically expanded their access and control while isolating her from independent financial advice. They'd researched estate law, studied tax avoidance strategies, and consulted with other professionals about how to structure transactions to avoid detection. This wasn't impulsive greed, it was a long-term criminal enterprise. David's recall to the witness stand was the final nail in my parents' case. Elena had discovered that David had been receiving monthly payments from the stolen funds for over 3 years, meaning his earlier claims of recent discovery and innocent ignorance were complete fabrications.
Until the letter arrived.
Under oath, he was forced to admit that he'd known the money was coming from my grandmother's accounts and that he'd never questioned the source because it was financially beneficial to remain ignorant. His testimony revealed him as an active participant in the theft rather than an unwilling accomplice. Judge Harrison's questions during the proceedings made his growing disgust with my parents' behavior increasingly obvious. When Margaret tried to justify her actions as protecting family resources from my unstable judgment, he pointedly asked her about the legal and ethical standards for attorneys handling family financial matters. When Robert claimed his investment management had been successful despite the missing funds, Judge Harrison demanded detailed accounting of every transaction and fee structure. The judge's skepticism was palpable and devastating to their defense. The evidence presentation reached its climax when Elena played the complete series of my grandmother's audio recordings, including conversations where Margaret explicitly lied to her mother about account balances, investment performance, and fee structures. The recordings captured Margaret's manipulation tactics in real time, showing how she used my grandmother's trust and dependency to facilitate ongoing theft. Judge Harrison's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened to an elderly woman being systematically deceived by her own daughter about her financial security. But the moment that sealed my parents' fate came when Elena presented my grandmother's final letter, written just days before her death and hidden in the safety deposit box specifically for this situation. In the letter, my grandmother explicitly stated that if I was fighting for my inheritance in court, it meant that Margaret had succeeded in her theft and that all her evidence should be trusted over family claims about my mental state or worthiness. She'd literally written instructions from beyond the grave, predicting this exact scenario and providing guidance for how I should respond to family pressure to abandon my case. Judge Harrison's ruling was swift and comprehensive. He found clear and convincing evidence of systematic financial elder abuse, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal conspiracy to steal my inheritance. He ordered immediate return of all stolen funds with interest and penalties, bringing the total judgment to over $12 million. He also referred the case to criminal prosecutors for potential felony charges against both my parents, noting that the evidence suggested crimes serious enough to warrant significant prison sentences. Margaret's face went white as Judge Harrison read his ruling, while Robert seemed to age a decade in the span of those few minutes. David slumped in his seat like someone who just realized his life was about to change dramatically, and not for the better. The courtroom victory was complete and devastating, but looking at my family's destroyed faces, I felt more sadness than triumph. These were people I'd loved for 29 years, and watching their public humiliation and legal destruction was painful despite everything they'd done to me. As court adjourned and my family filed out without looking at me, I realized that winning this battle meant losing my family forever. There would be no reconciliation after this level of public exposure and legal accountability. They would never forgive me for refusing to accept their theft quietly, and I would never be able to trust them again after learning the extent of their betrayal and manipulation. The victory was total, but it came at the cost of every family relationship I'd ever known. But sitting in that courtroom surrounded by evidence of my grandmother's love and wisdom, I finally understood that I'd been fighting for more than money or justice. I'd been fighting for the right to trust my own perceptions, to believe my own experiences, and to demand accountability when people hurt me regardless of their relationship to me. The legal victory was important, but the personal victory of refusing to be silenced or manipulated was life-changing in ways that transcended financial considerations. 3 months after Judge Harrison's ruling, I was sitting in my grandmother's favorite chair in the house I'd inherited, surrounded by the belongings she'd saved for me and the financial security she'd fought to protect. The criminal cases against my parents were proceeding slowly through the system, with Margaret facing potential disbarment and both of them likely to serve prison time for elder abuse and fraud. David had negotiated a plea agreement that required him to return all the money he'd received and testify against our parents, but his cooperation couldn't repair the relationship we'd lost. The money was substantial enough to change my life completely, but the emotional healing proved far more complex than I'd anticipated. I'd spent so many years defining myself in relation to my family's approval and expectations that learning to trust my own judgment and build an independent identity was surprisingly difficult. Therapy became essential for processing the trauma of betrayal and learning how to form healthy relationships with people who wouldn't use my vulnerabilities against me when conflicts arose. Sarah and Jake had become my chosen family, the people who'd believed in me when my biological family was trying to destroy my credibility and autonomy. Sarah's friendship deepened as we worked together on establishing a foundation to help other families dealing with elder financial abuse, using my legal victory as a precedent for similar cases. Jake's investigative expertise proved invaluable in identifying other potential victims of family financial crimes, and we partnered with law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for detecting and prosecuting these cases. The foundation work gave my life purpose beyond personal healing, connecting me with dozens of people who'd experienced similar betrayals from family members they'd trusted with financial responsibilities. The isolation I'd felt during my legal battle was transformed into solidarity with others who understood the unique pain of being victimized by people who were supposed to love and protect them. These connections helped me understand that my experience, while devastating, wasn't unusual or indicative of any personal failing on my part. But healing also required accepting that some relationships were permanently damaged beyond any possibility of repair.
It all began on a
David
Tuesday
made
afternoon,
several attempts
a day
to
that seemed
reconcile after
ordinary
his
until the
plea
letter
agreement,
arrived.
claiming that he wanted to
remember the light
rebuild our
was fading,
relationship and
much like it
asking
is
me to
now.
understand the impossible position he'd been in between loyalty to our parents and acknowledgement of their crimes. His appeals were emotionally compelling, but I'd learned too much about manipulation tactics to trust someone who'd participated in my victimization for years while claiming to care about my well-being. My parents never attempted direct reconciliation, but they continued their manipulation campaign through extended family members who believed reconciliation was more important than accountability. Aunts, uncles, and cousins pressured me to forgive and move on, for the sake of family harmony, suggesting that my insistence on legal consequences was vindictive and harmful to everyone involved. These family members had never experienced the systematic betrayal and financial abuse I'd endured, making their advice feel tone-deaf and unsupportive of actual healing. The most difficult aspect of recovery was learning to trust new people after experiencing such profound betrayal from those closest to me. Building romantic relationships seemed impossible when I'd learned that even family members could lie to my face for years while actively working to harm my interests. Professional relationships were easier because they involved clear boundaries and mutual interests, but personal intimacy required levels of vulnerability that felt terrifying after my family had weaponized every weakness against me during our legal battle. But gradually, with consistent therapy and supportive friendships, I began to understand that my family's betrayal reflected their character flaws rather than my worthiness of love and respect. The foundation work connected me with other survivors who'd rebuilt their lives after similar experiences, providing models for how healing and growth were possible even after devastating family trauma. Their stories gave me hope that I could eventually form healthy relationships based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval tied to compliance with others' expectations. The financial security allowed me to pursue interests and goals that had been impossible when I was struggling to pay basic bills while fighting legal battles. I returned to school to study social work and elder advocacy, channeling my experience into expertise that could help other people navigate similar challenges. The education provided intellectual frameworks for understanding family dynamics, financial abuse patterns, and trauma recovery that helped me make sense of my own experience while developing skills to assist others. 1 year after the court victory, I received a letter from my grandmother's former neighbor, an elderly woman who'd been suspicious about Margaret's involvement in her mother's financial affairs. She thanked me for exposing the truth and explained that my legal victory had encouraged her to investigate her own family's estate planning before potential problems could develop. Her letter reminded me that justice in my case had implications beyond personal vindication, potentially protecting other elderly people from experiencing similar betrayals. The most profound healing came from accepting that my worth and identity weren't dependent on family approval or validation. For 29 years, I'd measured my success through their eyes, accepting their judgments about my capabilities, stability, and value as a person. Breaking free from those external evaluations was liberating but also terrifying, requiring me to develop internal standards for self-worth based on my own values and achievements rather than others' opinions. As I looked around my grandmother's house, now filled with evidence of the life I was building independently, I realized that her greatest gift hadn't been the money or even the justice we'd achieved together. Her true legacy was teaching me that I was worth fighting for, that my perceptions and experiences deserved respect, and that love without accountability wasn't really love at all. The family that had tried to silence and diminish me was gone, but in its place, I'd found the strength to create a life aligned with my own values and surrounded by people who celebrated rather than exploited my vulnerabilities. The empty chair where my grandmother used to sit now held her favorite quilt and a framed photo of us together, reminding me daily that real love involves protecting and empowering the people we care about rather than controlling and manipulating them for personal gain. Her wisdom had guided me through the darkest period of my life, and her courage in documenting the truth had made justice possible when speaking up seemed impossible. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was proof that someone had believed in my worth and fought to ensure my future security even after she was gone. What have you learned from the people who've protected and believed in you when others tried to tear you down? How do you distinguish between real love and manipulation disguised as care? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with your own experiences or helped you see family dynamics differently, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the face of betrayal. Remember to share this with anyone who might be struggling with similar family conflicts, because sometimes knowing you're not alone is the first step toward finding your voice and fighting for your truth. Thank you for joining me on this journey of healing and justice, and I wish you the courage to trust your instincts and demand the respect you deserve in all your relationships.